Alrighty, I think we can get started now. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. My name is Kylie Uehara from NEM North America. We have some amazing panelists that we'll be hearing from today. We have Senior Solutions Engineer Suraj Patel and Lead Technical Analyst Ryan Mann, both from NEM. Today, we will be discussing NEM 3 and how it alters the economics of solar for business in California. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Suraj.
Thanks, Kylie. And thank you everyone for joining this webinar on the net billing tariff, also known as NEM 3.0. Before we go ahead and get started, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to cover. First, we want to make this webinar as informative and as interactive as possible. So as we're presenting, if you do have any questions, please go ahead and use the questions function in this webinar to enter any of your questions. We'll be checking that box periodically throughout the webinar, and we'll have a good amount of time towards the end for Q&A. Any questions that we don't get to by the end of the webinar, we'll be sure to follow up directly with you via email. Secondly, this webinar will be recorded and all the slides will be distributed afterwards. We want to make sure you have all the contents in your hands to be prepared for NEM 3.0. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I'll pass it over to Ryan for a quick introduction.
Hi everyone, I'm Ryan Mann. I'm a technical analyst with NL, and I've spent the past few years working on building out our software that we use to evaluate project opportunities for solar energy storage and electric vehicle charging for large commercial and industrial customers. And the software and the work that I do primarily serves to support our sales team, but I also help our BD team as well as our regulatory affairs team. And as a result, our team is sort of on the cutting edge of new regulatory changes, including NEM 3 here in California.
Thanks, Ryan. My name is Suraj Patel. I'm a solutions engineer here at NL. A bit of a funny story, Ryan and I have pretty similar backgrounds. Ryan and I actually met about 10 years ago in an engineering course, ironically, about solar energy at UC Berkeley. Both of us then joined the same consulting firm after undergrad, and after a few years made our way over to NL. So even though that Ryan and I have similar backgrounds, Ryan has a focus on the policy side. So he'll be covering a lot of the content around NEM 3.0. I work on evaluating our technical and economic potential for our behind-the-meter distributed energy resources in California. This primarily means solar plus storage, but we also look at standalone storage, electric vehicle charging, resiliency, and any other types of DERs. So we have a full agenda for today. As promised, we'll have the Q&A section at the end. But we'll go ahead and get started with an intro to NL. We'll say who we are and what we do. Afterwards, Ryan will go over the NEM 3.0 changes. Afterwards, we'll walk through an analysis that we did where we looked at different projects under NEM 2.0 and under NEM 3.0. Be sure to stick around for that section because some of the results might be a little bit surprising. Afterwards, we'll take a look about how storage will add value under NEM 3.0. So we'll look at a few load profiles and we'll see what the battery is doing. Afterwards, we'll summarize the whole webinar and leave you with some key takeaways to be prepared for NEM 3.0. So at NL, we do a lot of different things. I always like to say if there is a product or an offering in clean energy, there is probably a division at NL that specializes in it. I like to think of our offerings in terms of our on-site and off-site resources. Our off-site resources are large PPAs or also a retail energy supplier. But the content of this webinar will be focused on our on-site resources. This includes solar plus storage, demand response, fleet electrification, resiliency, etc. Ryan and I focus on the commercial and industrial sector. So the contents for NEM will be focused on that segment. So I know if you join this webinar, you might be interested in investing in solar or solar plus storage. I also know that first step might be a little bit challenging. There are different federal incentives, there are state incentives, different utilities have different rules, permitting could be different for the regions that you live in, interconnection can be confusing, construction could be long. Also, there's different revenue streams you can opt in and opt out of. All of this can make this whole process seem quite daunting. That's why it's really important to partner with the right organization. The right organization can make this whole process seamless for you. Here at NL, we've had decades of experience in the California market. We've helped customers with their sustainability and energy needs, and we really want to be that partner for you. As I mentioned in the previous slide, NL does a lot of different things, so we have that opportunity to be a one-stop shop for you. For example, if you're thinking about the future and you want to electrify your fleet, or you want to provide EV chargers for your employees or your customers, we can go ahead and do that and make sure it's powered by the solar plus storage system as well. So it all be powered by clean, renewable energy. If you're affected in the summers by what seems like every summer in California with the outages, and you'd like to invest in resiliency, we can go ahead and design a solution specifically for you. So we'll have our contact information at the end of the webinar, but please reach out to me or Ryan if you are interested and we can take a look at your site. So with that, I'll pass it on to Ryan.
All right, so we're going to start here by taking a quick minute to go through the abbreviated history of NEM 3, and then we'll proceed on to what some of the commercial implications are. So one of the first key dates to note in the development of a successor tariff for NEM 2.0 was the release of the proposed decision for the NEM successor tariff. And normally, when it comes to the California Public Utilities Commission proceedings, normally a proposed decision is close to the end of the process. But in this case, there was over a year of continued debate and revisions to the tariff until the final decision was actually issued in December of last year. After that vote happened, part of that decision included a 120-day window where customers could continue to submit interconnection applications and continue to take service under the NEM 2.0 tariff. And that will end in just a few days here, where customers will then begin to transition into NEM 3 for new customers who are submitting an interconnection application after that April 14th deadline. However, it's worth noting that the utilities have not implemented NEM 3.0 in their billing systems because of some of the additional complexity that it contains. And so customers who submit applications effectively between now and the end of this year will likely be on NEM 2.0 temporarily, and then will be transitioned over to NEM 3 as the utilities begin to support it in their billing system. So December 15th, which is exactly 1 year from the final decision, will be the last day for the utilities to have NEM 3.0 ready to go in their billing system. And it's just worth noting one exception to that, which is that for PG&E non-residential customers, PG&E effectively has an additional 6 months to get this implemented in their billing system because of some of the additional complexities and sort of idiosyncrasies of their billing system. So there is sort of a split implementation date for NEM 3 across the different utilities, and that is not too different from what happened in NEM 2 as well. And part of the reason that there was such sort of extended debate and revisions here around NEM 3 was that there were a lot of competing objectives that the CPUC and the various parties were attempting to balance. They had a statutory mandate to continue sustainable growth for the customer-sited renewables market. They wanted to consider disadvantaged communities and low-income customers, and they also wanted to develop a cost-based export compensation tariff that was fair to both participants in the net metering successor tariff as well as to non-participants. And this is a quick overview of some of the high-level differences between NEM 2 and NEM 3, and we'll get into some of the finer details shortly here. But really the major thing to note about NEM 3.0 is that in a sense it isn't net metering at all. There is no longer any tie between the retail rate for electricity and the export compensation rate that eligible renewables would get paid when participating in this tariff. So NEM 2.0 was tied to the retail rate, as was NEM 1.0. NEM 3.0, aka the net billing tariff, is tied to something new called the avoided cost calculator. And this is a spreadsheet that was developed by the consultancy E3 for the California Utilities Commission. And this is meant to represent the marginal or the avoided cost to the utility associated with distributed energy resources. And this avoided cost calculator has values that are highly granular. They're hourly. And the NEM 3 export compensation rate takes those values from the ACC, the avoided cost calculator, and averages them by month and by day type and by year, but leaves that hourly granularity. Whereas NEM 1 and NEM 2, because they're tied to the retail rate, they only vary by TOU period. So in effect, we are going from having 6 values per year for most customers for on-peak, mid-peak, off-peak, to instead now having 576 different values for each year. So it's a substantial increase in complexity here for this rate. And then a somewhat more minor detail, especially for non-residential customers, is that NEM 3.0 is using instantaneous netting rather than interval netting. Interval netting represents 15-minute or hourly netting, depending on the customer class. With instantaneous netting, effectively both channels of the smart meter, both the import channel and the export channel, are getting used. And then finally, as mentioned on the prior slide, eligibility begins in just a few days for customers who submit interconnection applications, and NEM 2.0 will begin to sunset. So NEM 2.0 has been around for about 6 or 7 years now, and those customers will continue to stay on NEM 2 for the duration of the 20-year term, but for new customers who are submitting interconnection applications after this Friday, they will be eventually placed on NEM 3.0 when the utility billing system is ready. And so now we're going to just linger on NEM 2.0 just briefly here before we explain NEM 3.0 to make it a little bit clearer what some of the differences are. And really the key concept that NEM 2.0 introduced, and it was in a sense kind of a bit of a stepping stone to what is now NEM 3.0, is this concept of non-bypassable charges. And the idea with non-bypassable charges is that there are certain costs that are paid for currently through dollar per kilowatt hour charges, but they don't really represent the cost to the utility of generating or delivering electricity. They are fixed and policy-driven costs, public purpose programs like energy efficiency programs or discounts for low-income customers. And they are not really being avoided when a customer produces electricity, whether it is for on-site use or for export to the grid. And the concept under NEM 2.0 is that customers that export, they do not, they effectively are not getting compensated at the full retail rate. They're getting compensated at the retail rate minus these non-bypassable charges. So in effect, it's the retail rate minus 2 to 3 cents, depending on the customer rate class. So this is showing an example for a PG&E large commercial industrial customer, a B20 customer on secondary voltage. Here we see the retail rate, which varies between about 7.5 cents and 20.5 cents. And then we are subtracting out the non-bypassable charges, and that gets you the export compensation rate. And now this is NEM 3.0. As you can see here, this is substantially more complex. I mentioned earlier going from 6 values to 576 values. And this is illustrating what this looks like for a PG&E non-residential customer during weekdays. And these are the 2023 values. It's worth noting that these evolve over time, and we'll get into some of that later. And just to quickly kind of explain this graphic, each of the rows represent 1 hour of the day, and each of the columns represent the months out of the year. And you may have heard, perhaps through some other sources, that the NEM 3 export compensation rate is substantially lower than what the NEM 2.0 compensation rate was, maybe giving an average value like 75% lower, or maybe heard it described as being, 7 cents on average or something like that. And while that is true on average, it is not really capturing the really dramatic variation that you see over the course of the day and over the course of the year from this export compensation rate. So you can see that right around now, in the middle of the day in the spring, these export compensation rates effectively go to 0. And that is when there's a lot of solar exports. And so the value, the compensation that's received for spring midday exports is very, very low. By contrast, the export compensation rate during the summer months, particularly in September, and during the evening peak, sort of the head of the duck curve, is extremely high. So effectively, for every weekday in September, there are export compensation rates that reach $3 a kilowatt hour, and the ones on the weekends aren't too much lower than that. And so that creates a really significant incentive to export during those hours, if it's at all possible. And then you can see that the values during the rest of the year are on average somewhere in the 5 cent range. So on average, substantially lower than under NEM 2.0, but with some pretty significant variation as well. And this is really just a different way of visualizing the exact same data now in a plot rather than in a heat map. So here we have the NEM 2.0 rate just as a basis of comparison. And this is showing the winter months only from the prior heat map. So you can see again here that the export compensation rates are far lower under NEM 3 than they are under NEM 2, particularly in the middle of the day. And you can see that there's a decent amount of variation by hour of day as well as by month of year. And really the outlier here in the winter would be the month of October, because you still have relatively high temperatures. You have characteristics that are somewhat similar to the prior month, September, the really high cost month. So there is perhaps a little bit of value in exporting during the 5 p.m. hour there in October, but in general, self-consumption is going to kind of be the name of the game during the winter. And now looking at the spring, really something very similar is true, maybe even more so here in the spring. This is where the export compensation rates effectively reach 0, especially in the middle of the day and early afternoon. And these values are pretty much always lower than what you're seeing for the NEM 2.0 export compensation rate. So once again here in the spring, really self-consumption, for instance, from an energy storage system is going to be the way to go, because exporting during these hours is really not going to generate a lot of revenue, and it will likely be preferable to store up that energy, that otherwise exported energy, and to save it for something else later in the day. And now this is the summer. As you can see in the middle of the day, the export compensation rate is still substantially lower than it was under NEM 2.0, hovering around the 5-cent range. And now the export compensation rate in the evening hours is so high that it effectively breaks the y-axis, and we'll zoom out here in a second. But you can see that it goes far, far higher than what it was under NEM 2.0. In other words, it's far higher than the retail rate. And so now if we zoom out, we can see that it goes up to about $3 a kilowatt hour in the month of September, and is still fairly high in August and even in June and July as well. So unlike in the winter and spring months, where it is a fairly straightforward self-consumption play, now it's something a little bit more dynamic, where there is still this incentive to self-consume in the middle of the day, but there's also this high incentive to preferentially export during the evening hours if it's possible. And to kind of preview a little bit, this is where having intelligent control software is important, because the kind of simple self-consumption modes that may have, that may make sense in other contexts, maybe like a Hawaii market that has more of a sort of static export compensation rate, no longer really works here. Here you need to basically be able to dynamically flip between self-consumption and export, depending on the relationship between the retail rate and the export compensation rate. So now we're getting into some modeling here that we performed using these NEM 2.0 and NEM 3.0 export compensation rates as an input to the modeling. So as a little bit of an overview here, the goal here is to do a comparison between NEM 2 and NEM 3, and then secondarily to look at the value of being able to export with the energy storage system, and as much as possible holding everything else constant. And in this case, we're looking at 7 different representative California sites, which we'll review in a minute. And we have solar and storage sizing and annual solar production data that is being held constant between the 2 cases. And the goal is really to look at year 1 savings rather than other more complex financial metrics. But for the purposes of a financial proposal, those financial metrics are important as well. But for the purposes of this, we're sticking to year 1 savings. So as a quick overview of these 7 different representative California sites, you can see here that's a fairly wide range of different load profile types, although all of these represent large commercial and industrial customers in California. But there's a pretty wide range of maximum demand here, ranging from about 500 kilowatts to over 5 megawatts. There are a variety of different investor-owned utilities here being represented, and I guess it's worth noting here that NEM 3.0 applies only to the investor-owned utilities and not to any of the munis in California, like SMUD or LEDWP. And we're looking at a variety of retail rates here, as well as different service voltages. So there is quite a bit of variation here in energy rates between something like a secondary DGR customer in SDG&E and something like a B20 direct access transmission customer in PG&E. And then we have a range of PV sizes and battery energy storage sizes that correspond to the size of the customer load. And as I mentioned before, these are being held constant, and it is probably the case that in reality, when evaluating a project and trying to really optimize the economics, the optimal solar and storage sizes are likely to be different under NEM 3.0 than they were under NEM 2.0. But for the purposes of this comparison, we wanted to hold that as a constant to really just look at the sort of direct first order effects of this change in the export compensation rate. So now key takeaways here. As one might expect, the savings from solar do go down on average here across these 7 sites as a result of the fact that this export compensation tariff is, this NEM 3 export compensation tariff is substantially lower than NEM 2 on average, and in particular during the midday solar hours. However, the silver lining is that energy storage in many cases can help make up some of the difference here. And you can see here that we've split it out into 2 separate cases. One is the no storage exports case, and the other is the with storage exports case. And particularly when storage exports are allowed, which Suraj will get into later, there is, the gap narrows quite a bit between the NEM 2 and the NEM 3 case. And again, this is on average across the 7 sites. And as we'll get into on the next slide, there is some fairly significant variation between sites. But overall, adding storage does really help. Let's see, and this is looking at the revenue again and showing that with exports, there definitely is a smaller gap between NEM 2 and NEM 3. But it's worth noting that storage, even though the total revenue is about the same, the split between solar and storage, as one might expect, is not the same. Storage is now providing a larger split of the total than it was under NEM 2.0, because it's really providing this crucial service of charging from otherwise exported solar to avoid getting paid these very low export compensation rates. And then in addition, for the storage export case, it is discharging during those summer evening hours and providing value to the grid and capturing those really high export compensation rate values. And now here, this is where we get to break it out on a site-by-site basis. And really the 2 takeaways here are that, first of all, there is substantial variation between the different sites. We can see that there are some sites here, like the food processor, where there is a substantial drop. Both bars in each pair here represent NEM 3.0, one without exports and one with exports. And 100% here represents basically the idea that NEM 3.0 offers the same amount of annual revenue as NEM 2.0. So here for the food processor, we're hovering at around 75% for both the non-export case and the with storage exports case. And in that case, there's really just not, there is just a substantial impact from the switch from NEM 2.0 to NEM 3.0. There are other cases, though, like the food manufacturer or the glass manufacturer, where the impact isn't so substantial, and actually, it looks like in the export case, it's actually possible to get higher revenue under NEM 3 than it was possible under NEM 2. And then the other potential variation between sites is what's the difference between non-ESS export and with ESS export. As you can see, in some cases, there's not a big difference between the 2, but then there are some cases like the entertainment venue where there is a substantial difference between those 2 cases, where being able to export during those really high value summer evening hours adds a lot of additional revenue. And this ultimately comes down to the load profile.
Thanks, Ryan. Hopefully now that you have a good overview of how the savings have changed when you add storage, what I want to do in this next section is to visually see what the optimization software is doing to create that value. So we'll take a look at two different load profiles, one for a winter month and one for a summer month, and we can see the differences of what the battery is doing. So this load profile is a 2-day period that we took from one of the 7 sites we did the analysis on. You can see for this customer, the gray shaded region represents the original building load. This is the load before any solar plus storage. So you can see on the first day, it starts around 500 kW and goes up to about 2.5 megawatts. And then on the second day, it ramps all the way up to about 4 megawatts. The graph on the bottom represents the export compensation rate for the month of February. So you can see that it oscillates around 5 throughout the 2 days. Audio was lost. In comparison, the NEM 2.0 oscillates around 10 cents and 15 cents. So you can see under NEM 3.0 it's substantially less. So I'll start off by overlaying the solar. You see the solar comes online around 7 o'clock, peaks in the middle of the day, and then wraps up in the evening for both of the days. The pink line represents the post-solar load. This is the load the battery will try to optimize against. So this blue line now is the post-battery load profile. And you can see for both days, it charges from the solar in the middle of the day. This is represented by the hashed line. On both days, it charges up to 2.5 megawatts. It does this intentionally. What the optimization software does is it predicts what the building load will be for the next day, the next month, and it'll then optimize against it. So in this case, the battery predicts what the building load will be for the whole month, and then it will predict how much peak shaving it can do for the off-peak and the on-peak. So as a reminder, you're charged with demand charges, which are, there's 2 of them. There's one for the off-peak period and one for the on-peak period. So it believes that it can shave for every single day of the month, the peak down to about 2.5 megawatts. So it'll set a limit on that. So we'll charge up fully during that period, and then you can see it then discharges during the on-peak period. This is the 4 to 9 period in California. So you can see in this, charges up from the solar, discharges it during this time, and it gets close to about 0 kW. You can see on the second day, there is a little bit of demand charge management. Most of the solar took out most of the peak load, but there is that remaining amount that it shaved down. And then also on the second day, it dropped it to closely 0 kW. So what's important is what the battery also is not doing during this winter day. The battery is not dropping below 0 kW. It does not see value in exporting during this time because the time of use period, the retail import rate, is closer to about 15 cents for the on-peak period for TOU 8, whereas export compensation rate is closer to 5 cents. So it would rather participate in energy arbitrage and demand charge management than to export during this time. Now, this is different than what I'll show on the next graphic for a summer day. So again, this is the same customer load profile, but this is taken in the month of August. Didn't want to pick a month in September because I think it is pretty obvious of what the battery would be doing. But you can see on this day, it's relatively flat for the first half of the day, and then it goes up to about 1.5 megawatts, and then ramps all the way up to about 5 megawatts on the second day, and then drops back down. The bottom graph again is the export compensation rate. So you can see for most of the day, it's below what would have been NEM 2.0. But there are a few hours in the evening periods where the export compensation rate skyrocketed to about 70 cents a kilowatt hour. Under NEM 2.0, it was closer to around 15 cents. So we can take a look at what now the solar is doing. Because the load is less on the first day, the solar is actually would be exporting if there was no storage system. So it takes out a huge chunk of energy in the middle of the day. There is some demand shaving done by the solar. But when we layer on the storage, and let's ignore this for now, you can see that the storage is then charging up. So the load actually comes back to around 1.5 megawatts on this first day, and it's not exporting anymore. It's self-consuming, so it's charging up the battery during this period. On the second day, it does that same amount to about 3.5 megawatts. Again, this is looking out for a whole month. It determined the limit would be about 3.5 megawatts. And then it charges up fully during this period. And then it discharges during these hours where the export compensation rates were really high. It sees a lot of value in the 70 cents per kilowatt hour export compensation. But it is also managing a few different revenue streams in the same boat. So you can see over here, it is also exporting during the 4 to 9 period. So it's reducing your on-peak demand and doing some energy arbitrage, charging up during the off-peak from the solar, doing a little bit of demand charge management for the off-peak, but it's really focused on exporting during this time. So this next graphic might be my favorite of the webinar. I think it does a great job of illustrating the differences between NEM 2.0 and NEM 3.0. This is taken from that same site we walked through in the last 2 slides, but it's a monthly distribution of the savings. Just to orient ourselves, the green represents the demand charge management from the storage system. The blue represents the energy arbitrage from the storage system, and the pink represents the energy savings from the solar. We are not including the demand savings from the solar just because there could be a cloud on a certain day and that could ruin the whole demand charge savings from that. So it's not as reliable as these 3 other revenue streams. So you can see for the winter months, it oscillates around $50,000 to about $100,000 of savings per month. Now you can see in the winter months, or sorry, the summer month, it's substantially higher. It's closer to about $200,000 in savings. There's a few reasons why that happens. One, there's a little bit more solar during the summer. The days are a little bit longer. But really, what is causing this is in the summer, it gets hot in California. And when it gets hot, most folks turn on their air conditioning. With everyone turning on their air conditioning, there is a supply and demand constraint on the grid. So utilities usually increase their energy and demand rates during the summer months. Higher rates equals a greater opportunity for savings for solar plus storage. That's why you'll see almost a 2x jump in the savings during these months under NEM 2.0. Now, as we take a look at NEM 3.0, you'll see that the savings are about the same for the winter months, maybe slightly less for each of the respective months. In the summer, it's slightly less compared to June, July, and August. But you'll see one big outlier, and that is the month of September. If you think back to Ryan's first few slides, there is a $3 per kilowatt hour export compensation rate in the month of September. What the optimization software is doing is it's charging up and it's discharging fully during those periods. So the blue bar represents energy arbitrage, which is exporting to the grid. And this is about $300,000. This is more savings from just one revenue stream for 1 month than it is for the entire January, February, March, April, and May combined. And that's really the value that we see of adding a storage system under NEM 3.0. You can take advantage of this 1 month or a few months in the summer of export compensation rates being very high. So I'm seeing a lot of questions come into the chat. I know this is a lot of new material, so please continue to ask questions. We'll have a good amount of time towards the end to answer those. Now, we've been talking about exporting quite a lot. That is a key revenue stream under NEM 3.0. It is not as simple as it seems, though. Utilities are hesitant to allow storage systems to export to the grid unless they are charged from 100% on-site renewable energy. Utilities do not want brown electrons being exported to the grid. And when I say brown electrons, I mean if the battery were to be charged from the grid, which is comprised of fossil fuel sources, and then discharged during that time, utilities do not want to give credit for NEM for those. So there's two ways in the roadblocks for storage systems to export. One is having a certified power control system. This means that your software is certified from the utilities to never export brown electrons. The second way to do this is through a physical relay, or a functional equivalent approved from the utility. Here at NL, we've tried with both of these, and we've had more success using a physical relay. We are able to export using this method, but it's not as simple as showing up with a relay to the utilities and getting sign-off. Utilities really want to trust providers that they will install it correctly and it won't be exported. That trust takes years and years of working together. So if you are interested in solar plus storage under NEM 3.0, you want to make sure that your battery provider has experience with those utilities and is able to export. Here at NL, we do have sites that are able to export storage now under NEM 3.0 and take advantage of that revenue stream. So I know we've talked about a lot of different things. I do want to bring it back home and leave some time for questions at the end. So NEM 3.0 is here. I know it's been awaited for the past year or 2 years or so. But what you'll see is reduced compensation rates for most hours of the year. And this will really mean that there'll be reduced savings for solar-only projects. You'll see much less solar-only projects in California. Now, if you add a battery or a dispatchable asset that's able to control when you charge and discharge power to the grid, the economics can improve. I think in Ryan's slides, you saw that there was actually some sites that performed better with solar plus storage and exporting under NEM 3.0 than it would have been under NEM 2.0. So there is some fluctuation there, but generally we'll say that economics improve when you add a battery. This is because they can self-consume, they can save those exported, what would have been exported energy during the winter months, and during the summer months, it can export at those specific hours of the day. So the bottom line is, if you are a commercial industrial site and you're thinking about adding solar, it is almost a no-brainer to also consider adding storage to that system. Now, I personally have modeled hundreds, maybe 1,000 projects in California, and I've taken a lot of look at different solar storage opportunities, and I've put together a checklist of what I think makes a great solar storage opportunity. And when I say great solar storage opportunity, what I mean is having a system that has a capital expenditure and having savings that are proportionate to it. So an example of a project that wouldn't be great is if the CapEx is high and the savings are very low. That would take a very long time for the system to pay back for each other. This also would limit your ability for financing for most companies. So you want a project that has proportionally high savings with the capital expenditure cost. So when these three conditions are met, usually the projects are golden. They work well, they can be financing done. And the first one is being served under the right load serving entity. In California, if you're under the main IOUs, this is PG&E, SDE, SDG&E, or any of the CCAs, you're usually good. If you're on a municipality rate, those rates tend to have lower energy and demand charges, which is probably a good thing for you because your bill would be lower. But in terms of having a solar plus storage system, if you have lower rates, you will have lower savings. Similar to what we saw with the summer and winter months on that distribution graph. You want to have higher rates for there to be a better opportunity for solar plus storage. So similarly, we want you to be on the right tariff. So B19, preferably B20 for PG&E, TOU 8D or E for SCE, and DGR or ALU TLU for SDG&E. Those tariffs have the highest demand and energy charges in California. So if your bill is high, there's a great opportunity for renewable assets to tackle those. And finally, the most important criteria that I see is having a high load profile. Having a peak load that's 1 megawatt or above tends to mean that you're on the right tariff, you have a large bill, and you have this great opportunity for solar storage. I have a note here that says, peak loads above 3 megawatts, they sometimes might be on direct access. Projects that are in direct access are sometimes borderline. Most of them work, some of them don't. We can go ahead and take a look at that. Also, projects that are about 750 kW to 1 megawatt, those tend to also sometimes work, sometimes not work. We can always take a look at those. Projects that have a smaller load profile tend to not have as much savings to justify the capital expenditure of having a solar plus storage system. So another question we usually get is, does our load profile need to be spiky? Spiky load profiles are great for batteries because they can shave those peaks down. But what I'd say is when you're thinking about solar and storage, the load shape does not matter as much. Usually solar takes out a huge chunk of energy in the middle of the day and leaves 2 peaks at the end. Those 2 peaks are what the battery can shave. Now under NEM 3.0, if you have a large solar system, you definitely want to have a battery because you want to limit those exports during those winter months and save up for those summer months when export compensation rates are higher. So with that, I'll end the presentation there. I just want to say thank you so much for your time. We really do appreciate it. Below are my email and Ryan's email. So if you are interested in evaluating solar plus storage now under NEM 3.0, please go ahead, shoot us an email, and we can get started on that. And with that, we'll also commence the Q&A session. So if you haven't used the question function in this chat, please go ahead and enter some questions there. So I see the first question come in. How much visibility do we have into the future export compensation rates? And what is the relative impact to solar plus storage? Ryan, do you want to go ahead and take that question?
Sure, I can take that one. So the avoided cost calculator includes values all the way out to 2052. And it's worth noting that NEM 3.0 customers have the option to lock in their export compensation rates for the first 9 years to provide a little bit of additional kind of bankability for their projects. However, the avoided cost calculator does get updated. It gets major updates every other year. It gets minor updates in between. And it does seem quite likely that there could be significant updates to the ACC that then flow into the NEM 3 export compensation rates after the next major update. And the hope is that the value should start to stabilize a bit after that. And let's see, to the extent that those export compensation rates go up, I guess to the extent that they go up in the middle of the day, that could potentially help the business case for solar. To the extent that those export compensation rates go up outside of solar production hours, for instance, during the evening hours, that will increase the relative value of storage.
Great, thank you, Ryan. I see another question come in. how do you capture the hours of high expert compensation rates in the summer evenings while making sure you have enough to meet your load? This is a great question, and a question we get quite a bit also. The purpose of a storage system is not to offset your energy for every hour of the day. The storage system is really there to minimize your bill at the end. And so you're charged at different times during the day. So I can show on one of the slides. We look at this right here. The gray bars over here represents grid charging. So the storage system is not trying to provide energy throughout the whole day for you. What it's trying to do is determine what periods of time are the most effective to use from the battery rather than the grid. A lot of times, those are the on-peak periods. So this is the 4 to 9 period when energy and demand rates are really high. The battery doesn't see much value in providing energy, say around 2 a.m. in the morning. Instead, it will prioritize these that will lower the bill for you. Let me take a look at some of the questions. Ryan, let me know if you have any questions you see in the chat too. I am concerned about power outages in the summer. How does NEM 3.0 help me add resilience? That's a great question. NEM 3.0 theoretically should help the grid with resiliency in the summer months. As more storage assets come online in the coming years, they'll be discharging during these hours in September when there is the most constraint on the grid. Again, this could be long in the future and is not a guarantee, and there could be other reasons for outages. Here at NL, we have 2 solutions for resiliency. The first one is a simple backup. So this is a solution that we can add on to our solar plus storage. So this is solar plus storage and some resiliency hardware. So that will help us isolate from the grid. So this includes a microgrid controller, some switch gear as well, and we can provide backup for about 4 hours with some of your critical loads. If you want more resiliency, we can design a system that can accommodate your needs. This will likely be associated with some sort of distributed generation that's on demand, and we can back up the entire facility's load for as long as you'd like to go through some of that. Let's see. What are requirements you found for storage-only opportunities? How should we think about storage only when we can't add solar for a variety of reasons? It's a great question. Let me take a look at this. So I'd say for storage only, a lot of these same criteria applies. You want to be on the right utility. You want to be on the right tariff as well. The main thing is if you have a large load profile, that's probably the #1 indication that a storage system can help out. The one difference I'd say between solar only and solar plus storage is the load shape. Load shapes that tend to be flat might not be the best for storage only. We want load profiles that are a little bit peaky, and those can help, the battery can help shape those peaks and save you on demand charges there. So I'd say most of the criteria is about the same there, but that's one thing you want to keep in mind for a storage only opportunity. So I know we're getting close to time. Let me take a look. I know there's quite a lot of questions in it, so we won't have a chance to answer all of them, but we'll answer one more, and then any of the other questions that you've put into the chat, we'll be sure to email you directly with an answer. Let's see. In Ryan's presentation, we saw the contribution for storage is higher. Does that mean that storage system sizes will increase? Ryan, do you want to go ahead and take that? I can pull up the right slide.
Sure. Yeah, I think I kind of hinted at this when I mentioned that for the purposes of this analysis, we kept the storage size constant, but in likelihood, exactly as you said, the optimal storage size and solar size under NEM 3 are likely to be potentially different from those under NEM 2. This is likely to be highly kind of customer specific, so I don't want to generalize too much here, but it probably is fair to say that the optimal solar size could be a little bit smaller than under NEM 3 than it was under NEM 2, and the optimal storage size probably would be a bit bigger under NEM 3 than it was under NEM 2. But really it depends on what the customer's site load is, as well as what rate tariff they're on.
Gotcha. Thank you. And we'll try to answer one more question, and then we'll probably have to stop the webinar there. Ryan, I think this question will probably be for you as well. Let's see. The value of energy arbitrage / export compensation is determined by wholesale market rates question. Or does the IOU determine, and thus how can it raise or lower as they want?
Yes, so I guess, yeah, it's worth noting that, yeah, energy arbitrage here, unlike in the utility scale context, does not refer to arbitraging on wholesale energy prices, but effectively on managing two different things at the same time, which is sort of somewhat unique to this new NEM 3 use case, and increasingly becoming common in the behind the meter energy storage space. So in effect, what is sort of happening is that the customer and the customer's battery here is going to be arbitraging on the import rate, the retail rate, the time of use rate, in addition to arbitraging on the export compensation rate, this sort of new hourly dynamic tariff. And in a sense, also arbitraging between those two things. So to pick an example here, two quick examples here that Shiraz gave, in a spring month or winter month, what might be happening is that the solar would otherwise be exporting to the grid. You'd be getting this very low export compensation rate. You are effectively charging up and getting nearly free solar electricity during those hours. And then when you are discharging in the evening hours, you are discharging to displace retail electricity costs. You're effectively self-consuming overnight. So you're sort of arbitraging between the midday export compensation rate and the evening or overnight retail rate. Then in the summer months, say in the month of September, what you might be doing is you are still charging from that otherwise exported energy. You're charging at these fairly low 5-cent export compensation rates, but then you might be discharging and primarily not just offsetting customer load, but exporting back to the grid at these really high export compensation rates. So in that case, what you're doing is you're arbitraging between the midday ECR and the high evening export compensation rate. And this really just speaks to how kind of complex this new use case is, and the value of having software that can kind of dynamically evaluate both the import rate and the export rate and come up with a battery dispatch profile that is sort of intelligently arbitraging on both of those data streams.
Great, thank you, Ryan. I know we're a few minutes over time, so appreciate everyone's time here, and that concludes today's webinar. Thank you.